We are okay. We are now recording. Thanks everybody for tuning in to the first episode of whatever we end up calling this. Um, my name's Phil, and this is my friend Julian.
My name is Julian Zier.
Yeah, and we had the idea to have a podcast about a subject that we both really care about. Uh, Concerning mental health, how that directly correlates to being an American male in 2019.
Yeah.
Basically, uh, one of the things that uh, really spearheaded this for me, um, well, it was a number of things. Some of the tragedies that you see happening around the world in America, around the world, and things that you've just been hearing about since a long time ago. The difficulties, the tribulations, and the trials of being a man, and what comes with the expectations that we as men are held to, in contemporary culture. The roles that we're supposed to play at work, in family, in friendships, and intrapersonally when we are just alone, you know? So I'm brought on my friend Julian here to have some open and honest discussions about this stuff to see primarily if we could, if this could be helpful to anybody out there. If you're a guy, you know, let me say right away, if you're not, this is not just for people with penises. This is for, if this information is useful to you, it's useful to you. It's just that me and my friend here, Julian, we are men, and a lot of the problems that we are going to talk about directly are about men, about guys. But you can be anybody and listen to this. It doesn't matter. And yeah. So, any input, Julian?
Yeah. I guess I would just sort of echo that. That regardless of what you identify as, I think everybody's life is kind of interpolated by masculinity and experience. Everybody has masculinity inside of them, so I think that talking through that can be useful. And yeah.
Totally. So, one more warning is that we don't have this episode isn't scripted. We have generally kind of some notes that we're gonna stick to, but it's an unscripted episode, so we might drift onto a subject that might be really personal. It could be something that might make you upset, might piss you off, might trigger you, or make you recall a memory or something that could ruin the rest of your day. So just to let you know, this is a totally no rules, no unscripted thing where anything goes. I didn't talk about this with Julian yet, but yeah, I mean, if you can say whatever you want, man, and I'm not really like, if we're gonna help people and and if there's going to be I think any conversation about men's health, addressing what men are like and what is expected of us now, it has to be no holds barred. Because if we start saying, well, you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that, this subject is too sensitive, like, then who's going to talk about it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're totally leaving it up to anything, any subject, and that's it. And maybe in future episodes we can have more guests on, and you can tell us, have your input as well, and definitely in the comments section, if you have any input or questions, leave them, and we'll talk about it on future episodes, or Whatever. So, having given that, I guess you could call that an introduction. We're going to move on to the intended context of this episode. So, when we're talking about men's health, men's mental health, which is what we're really here to talk about, we can't talk about men's mental health, the individual health of one man, without talking about the collective health of the surrounding culture, of the places, the people, the things, the symbols, ideas that surround this young person and follows them around until they're in the grave. And one of those ideas that that person, boy, whatever, metabolizes is this idea of the superhero, and how ideas of masculinity, ideas of strength, protection, what other ideas do we get from the idea of the superhero, the archetype of the superhero?
Yeah,
saving the world.
Yeah, success, like winning, right?
Yeah.
The ability to kind of like overpower others when necessary.
Yeah.
It's like power over versus like power to and power with.
Yeah.
And I think that there are both like positive and negative associations with the superhero, or positive and negative characteristics. There's some negative ones, but then there's also like resilience and tenacity and like critical thinking and sort of like taking responsibility for yourself and for others that may be dependent on you. Like I'm thinking about like Spider-Man, like with great power comes great responsibility type of thing.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know,
yeah.
And so I think that like the superhero can, in a positive sense, like create this kind of counterbalance to, or like I think of like the notion of like freedom, which is like a very central like American kind of like idea, as like being like this bird with two wings. And on one end it's freedom, and the other end it's like responsibility. And so like how do you use your freedom in a responsible way? And that's often not a conversation that's like being had, because the notion is like, oh, like you are free, so like freedom of speech, like, oh, like freedom of speech, this is like freedom to like be an asshole and to use your like talk down to others that are already marginalized and like things like that. But it's like,
Yeah.
what's responsible use of freedom, you know?
What are some more of those? We're talking about the negative aspects of the archetype of the superhero. One of them, I think, is a negative aspect of the superhero, which directly affects the mind of your average American dude, is this idea. It's a two-part idea. It's a two-sided idea. One, that the world depends on the superhero defeating the bad guy. The world is depending on the outcome being, I am the winner. I was the best. And clearly, since the rest of the world is depending upon me to satisfy this outcome, to create this outcome, clearly the remaining billions of people who are depending on me are incapable of doing that. So that must make me special in some way that sets me apart from the cosmos until we actually find people on other planets and stuff. So that's the first part. That's one negative aspect, I think, of the superhero archetype. And when I say superhero, I mean like, well, yeah, I mean what I just said. Coupled in with the second part, which is time. The superhero's legacy is told within a time frame that can be consumed in a fraction of the total lifetime of the person who is reading or consuming that story. So what we have is an insane separation of self from nature by making that person too special and imbuing them with crazy abilities that no one else has. And then doubly fucking with their perception of time, saying that the quicker this happens, the better. Because a movie only lasts 2 hours. A comic book can be read in a couple of minutes, maybe.
Yeah.
So that creates an anxious, impatient, delusional person who needs a lot of help. In I'm just talking about extreme cases. I don't mean like every
like
man.
Speed. I guess obsession with speed, especially like in work settings.
Yeah, impatience. I have to get this done. Everyone is waiting on me. And if I don't do this, then I'm the bad guy. I failed everybody. There's another job that the superhero has, and it's destroying the bad guy. So we talked about this in pre-show. What happens when the good guy becomes the bad guy? When depression and anxiety and those nasty feelings come up within the self. What does the superhero do then? So we have the suicide epidemic. You know, it's a bunch of superheroes destroying the bad guy because the bad guy convinced them that it was themselves. You know, so that's something. No, please offer. This is a
yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about this in two ways. Like, I'm thinking about like this idea that like real life is not so simple. Like, real life is not so black and white as like this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, and the solution to our conflicts is to destroy the like wrong or bad person or whatever. And like in nonviolent communication, which is like the system of like conflict resolution, they talk a lot about shifting from a needs-based view of other people's behavior versus like a moralistic view of people's behavior. So for example, like if somebody does something that like upsets you, you can mentally frame it as like, oh, this person is this, that, and a third. They're like a bad person, so therefore they need to be punished in some way for their wrongful actions. Versus perceiving that perhaps this person has some need that they're trying to meet, perhaps poorly, and first identifying what that need is, and then like trying to have that need met in another way that's not at the expense of the need that's not being met in me that caused me to be upset. So taking a needs-based view of other people's behavior kind of undercuts the sort of like logic that says that like violence is like what will resolve this conflict, because often it's like a conflict of needs versus like a conflict of versus good and bad. And I think that's like a thing that you definitely see in like superhero comic books, because it kind of like it cleanly splits the world in this battle between good and evil. That maybe this is a really outdated way of like viewing people. And especially when you think about on like the institutional societal scale, like things like school to prison pipeline and like you know, prisons and all these other things, it's like, how do we understand the behavior of people that do things that we might judge or deem as bad? Do we see them acting from a place of unmet need, or do we see them as acting from a place of inherent badness? Or like having this like from like a philosophical standpoint, like it's like an ontological question, like the core of their being is somehow corrupted, and so therefore they must be eliminated. Because for redemption or anything. Maybe this person is just like hungry, or this person is like has all these other unmet needs that they're trying to meet in this poor kind of way. I think
What
that, yeah.
what do you think? So we're talking to the depressed, anxious, self-deprecating American dude, man. Like, what does that individual need to overcome that when I become the bad guy and my expectations are to be the good guy and to overcome? What are some solutions for that? You know,
Mm,
like we can change the perspective of how we look at ourselves as men. I think it's a good idea to point out and highlight and illustrate those things that I was talking about earlier, those environmental elements that we've metabolized for decades, for years and years and years.
mm,
And they've become so seeped into our psychology that we forget that they're even there.
yeah.
You know, the whole house has been painted blue and we've lived in it for so long, we forgot what the color blue looked like because
Mm,
it's the only thing we've seen, you know? Um, yeah. So a lot of stuff that I watch on, at least in the media, in TV, in even a lot of stuff on like YouTube, where I'm going to upload this this video. Even on YouTube, like
yeah.
there seems to be this idea that, and this is something that in feminist circles where I observe and listen and have discussions and discourse. There's something I hear from women all the time. They're like, guys always feel like their fucking opinion is needed.
Mm,
There's something I hear from women all the time. They're like, your opinion. Look. You might be. I forget what her name was. Friend of. I wouldn't say her name on the show like that. You know, like put her information out there. But I had a friend say once very poignantly, you might be an expert. We get it. You're an expert at what you do. We don't care. Shut the fuck up.
mm,
We're just trying to have some like peace here, some just a more harmonious conversation rather than one person coming in and dominating the whole thing. But from the inner perspective in the mind of a man who needs help, that he's suffering from the same thing, isn't he? There's
mm,
this voice, this dominating
mm,
voice that never stops talking.
mm,
There's this
mm,
ceaseless, the ceaseless stream of unsolicited opinions on people, places,
mm.
ideas, concepts, whatever.
Yeah.
And I think, do you think that there's a kind of a reflection there, you think?
Yeah, totally. I think that what you're describing is like this like voice of the inner critic, or
Yeah.
like this kind of like subpersonality.
Mm.
And like it sounds like the question that you're asking is like how do like ideas around masculinity shape like the way that your inner critic kind of criticizes you, and
Mm.
how that kind of like you it's like similar to the situation you described where there's like a group of people and they're trying to have a discussion and this one guy is coming and trying to dominate it. Similarly within your own mind, it's like you have
Yeah.
all these different personalities, these different voices that are trying to work together to like make your life work, and then there's this dominating voice inside of you that's also trying to like kind of
Run the whole show.
right. And I don't know whether that, yeah, that would be like the inner critic. And so I think that for one, if somebody's really depressed and they're really anxious, I think that first and foremost, like one should get like professional help, but
Yeah.
also that like these feelings arise. I think it's really useful to always remember that like all of your feelings are rooted in needs. And so if you have a lot of,
You keep bringing. I want you to. Could you like rewind and unpack that a little bit more? I'm
yeah,
really interested in this like what you're talking about with that. Sorry
yeah,
to
yeah.
interrupt.
So
Yeah.
like the idea being that like all of your feelings are rooted in needs. So
Yeah.
if you're feeling good, it's because there are needs that are being met. And if you're feeling bad, it's because there are needs that are being unmet in that moment, right? So like because all of our feelings are rooted in our needs, then becoming aware of how you feel becomes incredibly important because by being aware of how you feel, then you understand what you need. And by knowing what you need and how to get those needs met, you become a responsible person. And in your relationships with others, by knowing the needs at the root of other people's feelings, then you can respond to them with greater empathy because the needs that they have are like human needs are sort of universal. So it's like the needs that they have are the same needs that you can relate to, even if they may be going about trying to meet that need in a completely different way. And so it's like oftentimes when we engage with others and they like respond to us in a way that doesn't meet our needs, the first like almost like psychological impulse because of our way of framing people in terms of good and bad is to frame them as like, you know, how they're like a bad person because they're not meeting our need, but simply they're just not meeting our need. Even if it's something as meaningful and important as like, oh, you said this thing, it doesn't meet my need to be respected,
Yeah.
right? So it's like you have a need to be respected, and this person spoke from another need that they have yet to identify, right?
Right.
And that's really where the source of the conflict is. It isn't in this it's not this like conflict between good and evil or like all these other things that you might then want to go and respond to in a way that's like emotionally violent or maybe even physically violent or like what have you.
How do we plug that into the mental health crisis that men in particular are facing? What are men missing? Why do we have the highest suicides? Why do we have why do we take we blow everyone in men in America? Now, if someone wants to correct this fact, it might have changed. It's probably changed by now, but I understand that men in America take more prescription medicines than like anywhere, like more than any other country whole entire country population. Take any other country, even China. So that I could be wrong about that fact, but I think it's true. I'm
Yeah.
willing for it to be wrong, but it's to illustrate my point, which is that how did we get here? Men commit the most suicides. We're going out there. We're shooting up schools, shooting up ourselves. You know, there's everything that we're talking about now. Like, what do men need? What do we need? What's missing?
Um, I think that what's missing is emotional validation.
Mm,
And I think that like uh men can be very emotionally invalidating towards others, and a lot of at least in my experience, like socialization from like childhood into adulthood through
yeah,
masculinity involves a lot of invalidation of emotions. And so by not validating your emotions, you don't understand the needs at the root of those emotions. So it like prolongs a sense of irresponsibility because you're not really aware of like what your needs are, your emotional needs, your mental needs, but then also sometimes even physical needs too. So
mm-hmm.
then like by invalidating having your own feelings invalidated, you invalidate your own feelings and
Yeah,
invalidate the feelings of other people around you. So you're essentially then just walking around being an asshole.
yeah,
You don't
yeah,
think people's feelings matter because you don't think your feelings matter.
yeah.
So it's like, and I think emotional
Yeah,
validation has a lot to do with that, and also um, like narrative. Like I think that there needs to be more images and representations and so on of like masculinity as being like emotionally intelligent masculinity. It's just like maybe
yeah,
what maturity looks like. Maturity and responsibility is like emotionally intelligent masculinity versus
yeah.
emotionally invalidating and kind of endlessly posturing like masculinity.
Yeah. There was a lot of the reason why I originally brought in the superhero archetype. You brought in a lot of really good positive aspects of it, which I totally. I mean, when I watch Marvel movies and I watch, you know, other kind of movies about superheroes and stuff, I I soak in um, those positive aspects. Really, I do. but I can't help but notice how, perhaps related also to the environmental metabolizing that men do, we take in these subtle nuances handed to us from our culture. It's Batman,
Right.
Spider
Right.
Man,
Right.
Iron Man. You
Right.
know, it's I can't help but feel like there is this programming that heroism is a male
Right.
trait. You
Right.
know,
Right.
like
Right.
it's like heroism in itself is something a woman can do, but
It's
a
not.
man should do. You
Yeah.
know, like, and so I've made lots of, personally, through meditation, I've identified so many problematic mental uh, things that pushed me into that kind of toxic masculinity.
Mm,
And
mm,
what has one thing that I have noticed is this one little voice that I've been carrying with me since I was, I guess, 5 or 6 years old. It's this: you're being a little bitch. Don't be a little bitch. Don't be a little girl.
mm.
You're acting like a girl. You're acting like a little punk, you know.
Yeah.
And that's bad.
Right.
And
You're being.
and yeah. And now that I'm older, now I'm 30, I'm 34 years old. I'm about to be 35. Now I look at it the other way. I notice that kind of behavior on the uptick, and I say, you're being a man right now. You're being such a fucking man, you
Mhm.
know? Like you are trying to save the world. You are trying to show a bunch of heroic behavior that no one really cares about.
Mm.
You're trying to make the world less mundane than it actually is and make yourself so special. Really, most people don't give a fuck about you.
Mm.
And if it's one thing I can drive home, I will say this at a risk to that third person that we're talking to in this conversation, the man, woman, or whoever struggling with toxic masculinity that's been metabolized from the environment or from parenthood or whatever, who where you feel like there's all this pressure on you to perform and to all deliver within a certain amount of time, or else annihilation and destruction are around the corner. I have some contradictory information that could be interpreted as bad news. Honestly, no one cares. Most people don't really think about you that much. I don't feel like most people think about me that much. Do you think I'm right about that or wrong about that, Julian?
Um.
Like, is everyone out there thinking about how the average man is conducting themselves throughout the day? You know, should they accept this invisible pressure, this pressure to perform and always activate and be ready to spring into action and take care of things? Like, is that,
Mm.
am
I
I
mean.
observing things right or wrong?
I mean. I would. I like. I think that the people that care about us think about us,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that like we are meaningful to like the people in our lives. But I think that like what I think that maybe our sense of what makes us valuable to others is skewed, and like maybe it would benefit us to have more of like a self-realization focus
oh
uh,
yeah,
than like a kind of like performative focus. Like how do you be authentic and like true to yourself and nourish the authenticity and truth in others
yeah,
versus like how do I live up to this like artificial standard about like what it means to be, like an important man in the world. Because like maybe what you have to offer others is individual to you, and what I have to offer others is individual to me. And by being our true selves, that comes out versus like everybody's trying to do the same thing. It's
yeah.
like the world doesn't need a million people doing the same thing. It needs each individual doing what they individually can.
th- that fits into, can you wrap that into what you were talking about with needs?
Yeah, yeah. So like, I think that we all have a need for connection, and we have a need for consideration from others, and we have a need for to have empathy and to feel loved. And you know, we're often taught that the ways in which we can become worthy of connection and worthy of like empathy and worthy of being loved is to perform masculinity correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's not what makes us worthy of those things. Maybe you're just inherently worthy of it by virtue of it.
Yeah.
And other people are worthy of those things too. And so, like, maybe a lot of behavior that we associate with toxic masculinity are just actually like um, like warped needs strategies. And
Mm.
it might be useful to think about what needs are at the root of the various behaviors that we're engaging in that are toxic, and how do we go about meeting those needs in less toxic ways.
I'm so glad that you just said all of that. What way can we help our one listener right now? What can they take from this episode if they're feeling, if they've made it this far and have found it this informational? What can we suggest that, what's one thing they can click click off of this episode and go do? I think I
Um,
can think of something.
Yeah. I guess I can think of like two things. One, you brought up meditation earlier, and I think
Yeah.
having a daily self-reflexive practice is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Um, and I think two, like you can just go on Google and type in like feelings list NVC, and then type in needs list NVC, and then look at the list and start to like memorize it. And then as you go about your day, start thinking about like, when you're observing yourself doing a thing, like what need am I trying to meet?
Yeah.
Or like when I'm feeling a certain thing, like let's say you're feeling upset, ask yourself like, what do I need and I'm not getting?
Yeah.
And that kind of reflexive practice, I think, be extremely illuminating towards understanding like what's actually motivating your behaviors. And it kind of does it in like a clean way, because it's like then even when you're doing things that are problematic, you're not thinking about it in terms of like, oh, I'm like a bad person because I'm doing this, but rather it's like, oh, in this moment, I really need to feel like worthy of connection. So by doing this, I'm not getting that need met, and I'm actually infringing in the need of another person. So how do I go about this differently? Like
Mm-hmm.
if in the moment I'm sitting in a room full of people and they're having a conversation and I'm trying to like dominate the conversation, maybe in that moment, like I just need to feel heard and I need to feel understood and I need to feel like I'm important.
Yeah.
But this isn't meeting my need for these things because nobody in the room is giving me these things as a result of how I'm acting, and I'm actually infringing on other people's need to feel safe and to feel like, you know equal and intelligent and all these other things. So how can I go about meeting that need for importance differently?
Mm-hmm.
That's a more useful way of like reflecting on behavior than like, oh, I'm shitty, so therefore then that's how you become like the bad guy in your own head, and then you start becoming self-destructive and all of that.
The person who is listening to this information might ask, well, how did things get this bad? How did it, he might be asking, how did it get this bad? How did it, it's been going this way for so long. I'm stressed out. I'm fed up. I'm fucking sick of, I'm sick of this person, that person. I'm sick of my job. I'm sick of my teachers. I'm sick of my professors. I'm sick of of you name it.
Mm.
Like, what causes a person to put off having their needs met and taking on this role of this like stoic superhero?
Mm.
You know, what why do people do that, do you think?
I think
I Go ahead.
no,
It was weird how I just asked you a question and I started answering it.
no, no, no. Yeah. I mean,
Sorry about that.
and we'll go back and forth. But I think that like it goes back to like emotional invalidation from like a very early age, and also like a need to feel strong and a need to feel like you're capable of dealing with life and you're capable of, like being resilient in the face of the challenges that come your way. I think that's really important. It really is important to feel strong, and it is important to feel like, you're not like the victim of your experiences and circumstances, but you're capable of overcoming those experiences and circumstances. And it's like, um, I think that like that goes I think that goes back to like the hero. And I liked what you said about, the hero always being a man, or that's like a masculine trait.
Yeah.
I think that everybody needs to feel like the hero in their own personal life story,
Yeah.
and that hero is capable of like overcoming the various circumstances. And that's not just for men, and it's not just for women either. It's like people of all genders and all races and all these other things, and class positions and so on. So like I think that like everybody wants to, like, especially little boys, I think that the notion of like being obsessed with superheroes comes from like, I think
That
that
need for strength, right?
yeah, yeah,
Maybe.
like movies and TV shows and these kind of myths, these public myths,
Yeah.
like forget who said it, but it was like dreams are like the mythologies of like the night, and like
Yeah.
and like myths are like the collective dreams of the day.
Yeah.
And in many ways, it's like dreams sometimes perform this kind of wish fulfillment function where like when you're a kid and you're small and you're like smaller than all the adults around you, you don't have very much power or say in what your day looks like. You look to these superheroes that you can kind of identify yourself with, and then they're kind of like fulfilling this need to have power and strength and to overcome
To
and
win.
and to win and have all these things that as a little kid you don't. But by believing in it, you feel like one day you can. And
Right.
like, like I was actually thinking about this because a little bit before we started Skyping, while I was like preparing my food or whatever, I was on YouTube and I had the thought that like, oh, like I kind of want to get into like blaxploitation movies because I haven't seen a lot of them, and they seem really funny. And so I was looking at the trailer on YouTube of this documentary on like blaxploitation movies, and they were talking about like, this notion of like the badass like
Yeah.
hero in like blaxploitation films.
Shaft.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. To the point where it's really campy and like corny, but at the same time, it's like it arose at a time where there was like all this fear, especially on like the tail end of like the civil rights movement, where there was all this fear of like black violent retaliation that
Yeah.
wasn't actually happening in the real world, and where like after the death of like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and like the Black Panther Party being like dismantled by the COINTELPRO and all these other things, there's like a real like threat to what would happen if like black people fought back. So like you couldn't do it in like the real world. So then you start to do it in movies.
Yeah.
And movies then become this kind of wish fulfillment where it's like this like black dude is like the fucking hero. He's like a badass and he has like all these women and he has like the gun and he can go and do whatever the fuck he wants and just be on top of the fucking world. And it's like in many ways that's like kind of like the wish fulfillment dream through the myth of like black exploitation.
Yeah.
And it's like
Yeah.
you just do that. Like if you can't do a thing in real life, you can build a story where you do it and that helps you to feel a little bit better and then also to believe in your capacity to like do what that thing represents. Like it doesn't literally mean that you have to be like Shaft walking around coding doing XYZ, but you could feel like, like
In that time period when you're watching it, you can kind of co-identify.
right. And
Is that true?
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's I think incredibly important for people who within the larger public imagination are always the villain, right?
Yeah.
It like
Yeah.
kind of versus that. And so like it reminds me of a who said it? Holy shit. I like hear all these brilliant things in the next episode. But like
Happens to me too.
It was a book and it was like, how does it feel to always be a problem? And it was basically talking about like blackness and particularly black masculinity as like always being framed as some kind of a problem.
Yeah.
And like I'm forgetting the context that this came up in. But
It wasn't Trevor Noah's biography, was it?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
How does it feel to lose your I wrote it. I wrote a bunch of shit down about it, so I'll like look at it and unpack them more later. But
Those are
basically,
brilliant ideas, and I can't think of two better people than you and I. I wanted to, let me just be open and honest. I wanted to do this podcast with you for a long time
yeah,
because you and I do not fit any of those stereotypes.
right.
And yet here we are having a completely sane, awesome discussion about these subjects, and, you know, I feel like for a lot of black dudes, and look, I'm not saying all black dudes, of course I'm not saying that to anybody whose brain just reflexed when they heard that. I'm
Yeah,
saying there is a stereotype out there that a lot of black dudes buy into where even thinking, and I want to know what your thoughts are on this. We can plug this into the show too, Julian, is that there's this stereotype or this idea that black dudes buying into this idea that you prioritize your mental health and you seek therapeutic mental help, that means you're gay. That means
mm-hmm.
you're like a weak pussy.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if you are some kind of pedophile. Like, oh, your brain isn't out, your brain isn't on
Yeah,
right. Oh, that, you know,
yeah,
and
yeah,
so that's a real thing that in America you can't talk about, especially if you're white. If you're white and you mention that, then you're labeled as a racist.
right.
But if you're like you or me and we talk about it, I think we have a little bit kind of like a zone to stand in to where
Well,
we can say it and just put it out there. And
yeah,
if you know, it's something that I deal with, even being as non-stereotypical to the whatever American eye would expect me to be, speaking African American vernacular, and being really into rap. I'm into rap, but being tough, stoic, strong, and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
all that kind of shit. I'm not like that at all, and yet I still deal with
Right,
that archetype. I still
right.
deal with that stereotype. How about you? I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah. I have so much to say about that. So,
Yeah.
to I guess go back because I feel bad not actually giving credit to where it's due.
Oh,
The
sure,
person who
sure.
said that quote was W.B. Du Bois in the book Souls of Black Folks, and
Oh,
basically asked the question, like, how does it feel to be a problem? And basically talking about how like white men stand for success where black men stand for failure, and
mm,
like the constant problematizing of like black people more broadly, not just black men. Where no matter how we're talking about it, whether it's from a conservative standpoint or a liberal standpoint, blackness is always the problem, right?
mm,
Um, but I think that yeah, like in a society where um, like black lives are not like not everybody agrees that black lives matter, like black inner lives then or black feelings then like matter that much less. Um, and so I think that in that kind of a context, like a lot of black men and within black masculinities like develop this kind of like armor where you
yeah,
have to be like extra strong and extra tough in order to
yeah,
endure all of the like suffering and invalidation that is going to come your way by virtue of being in this world as like a black man. And like I think that that's very much attached to something that I very much internalize. I'm not a tough guy. I've never been a tough guy. Like, but I've definitely internalized this notion that you know, like white men measure their strength and power by like how much they can do, whereas like black men measure their strength and their power by how much they can endure.
yeah,
And it's like
yeah,
this notion of like strength and toughness being defined by like how much suffering you can endure and still like keep it together
yeah,
is like that goes all the way back to the plantation. Like how many lashes can you take and then still get up and like go to work? You know what I
mm,
mean? So it's like I think that there's also a lot of fear too of like what happens when you start to delve into your inner world, because there's like generations of shit that has never been of really powerful feelings that have never actually been looked at.
y-
So
yeah. That
intimidating.
that is. it seems to jump on the very last thing you said there about dealing with those feelings. Black people, it feels like a luxury thing to be
Perfect.
able to address your mental health.
Yeah.
You know, like, and I've talked to some people who do fit a stereotype, who, I should probably find a better word to use than stereotype, by the way. If that word is offending anybody, I'm sorry. It's starting to offend me too, so whatever. But I've talked to certain people who are black, and I've talked about meditation, mindfulness, Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, the Vajrayana tradition that I follow, and stuff. And it's almost like it's like they're like, oh, well, that's nice that you can do that, you know, that those people accept you and they'll teach you and they'll talk to you and have you in class. But a couple of guys I've talked to have said they would never have me. I don't belong in that environment. They wouldn't have me there. You know, they'll have you there because you're like a well-spoken college educated black dude. And by the way, I'm not college educated, and I think I'm not very well spoken at all. But there's also that perception that the things that would propel me forward and allow me, and the character says, the person says, I would do that if I had the luxury, basically. But it's for white people. It's for college educated to, you know, white people, or it's for like some Asian dude or whatever. You know?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that there's a lot around that. Like, I've definitely had those experiences too, and I think this is a super important conversation to have, because you mentioned like Vajrayana, and you know, I started meditating within like the Zen like tradition, and I moved over into the tradition of like Kriya Yoga.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So I practice like Kriya Yoga, and I've definitely found that, like, for one, this is also something I'm only just starting to see, but like in New York, at least, there's like POC, like meditation classes, where there are a lot of people that like us have been like practicing these practices, doing these practices for years in like largely white communities, that then like teach those practices in safe spaces for like other people of color. And that like really starts to melt away at the notion that like, oh, this isn't for me, because now people, a lot of them are young people, have like spaces where they're surrounded by other people that look like them, that are like geared towards like teaching the same teachings and the same practices and like talking these things through. And so I think that that's one like really useful solution to it. But I think that there's a measure of truth to it. Not that meditation practice is only for white people, only for college educated people, because I don't believe that that's true. I believe it's for everybody that has consciousness inside of their body, right? Yeah. But like there is a degree to which like a level of exceptionalism makes it easier for certain types of Black people to navigate those spaces versus others in the gaze of white people. And so like my partner has like brought this up to me a lot, where it's like, yeah, I started meditating at a young age, and for me, I was usually the only Black person and like the youngest person within the Sangha, especially when I was going to like the Zen monastery and stuff. But it's like, yeah, I was like the youngest Black person, but I was also like an alternative Black kid, right? So like I was into like punk rock and metal and like all these other things, and I read philosophy. So that kind of like alternative Blackness meant that I was also familiar with like some white culture, and like a lot of white people view it as like your measure of civilization is like how well you know our shit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So it's like they start to see you differently than if you're a Black person that doesn't really consume white media. Yeah. Because then it's like, for them, their cultural products are like the measure of civilization. And that becomes so tricky, because then it becomes a whole thing of like, you know, if you're in this space where people are talking about like spiritual evolution, well, this notion of spiritual evolution is actually at the heart of racism.
Yeah.
This whole idea that Black people are less evolved. And so if they're not in this space, it's because they're not evolved enough to be in this space. And that's not true at all.
That's
But that's what's
yeah.
in their mind.
That is something that I have had to reconcile. I'd have to be honest. Sometimes a lot of these Vajrayana guys, even some of I mean, shit, a lot of the Zen, a lot of my Zen, I have like one Zen teacher and the rest are all Vajrayana dudes. And they're 100% of them are white. Two of them are not. Oh, I don't know what. Yeah, I don't know. But the majority of the spaces and the teachers and stuff, it is a white thing. And there are times when I'm in these spaces, and for example, I'm like I'm part of the Quantum School of Zen's online sangha, although I'm not really as strictly a Zen practitioner. The I wonder what it would be like if I showed up to a meetup group with those people, and it's kind of like when I order like DoorDash or whatever, and the person looks at me and is like, "Oh, you're Philip? Okay." It's like, "Oh, you're Black? You don't sound Black. You don't act Black. You know." I wonder what it would be like if I showed up to one of those to a meeting and just scared the shit out of everybody. Like, who's this dreadlock dude? Who's this guy? You know. And, you know, and that fits in with what you're talking about, the expectations that people have based upon like what you've consumed from other cultures and all that, and those measures and stuff like that. That is something that I want to talk about for the exact amount of time that we just talked about what we just talked about, and put a foot end on this conversation and save the rest for the next episode. How does that sound to you?
Yeah, that sounds good. I just wanted to make 2 points.
Go for it. Yeah, let's like have this be the foot end of this episode, and then so just go do your thing. Yeah.
So like the 2 points that I wanted to make was, one, I think that the other end of like that is also that like contemplative traditions exist in Africa and have existed in Africa forever. But it's like because Black folks in America, as a result of the sort of like narratives around Black people not having a history and not having like civilization and all those other things, like even in like spaces where there's like comparative religion or like comparative spirituality, African spiritualities and African religions are usually left out of the conversation.
Yeah.
That like in pre-colonial Africa, there were people that practice things similar to meditation or practice things similar to yoga. It's kind of like out of people's awareness. So this idea that like meditation is not for me comes from like not knowing that like there have been Black people that have been sitting and observing their interior awareness before even like any of this other colonial shit happened, right? Yeah. So that's one part of it. And another thing that I wanted to tie the two together is that like I think that there's a lot around like the hero as an archetype and like the savior complex, and also the hero and like the messianic figure, right? And like the hero as a type of messiah, the hero is like, you know, a symbol of the Christ, since that's like the messiah that we're all most like kind of familiar with. And I'm making these connections now for like the first time in my head, but like, you know, Paramhansa Yogananda, who is the teacher that brought Kriya Yoga to the West for the first time, wrote this book called The Second Coming of the Christ Inside of You. And it's basically talking about the Christ archetype as like a symbol of like the self, or like emptiness in like Buddhist terms. And so when looked at from that perspective, and like Carl Jung also used the same, like talked about the Christ symbol as a symbol for the self, and Gnostics, which is like form of esoteric Christianity, have long since believed that. And so when looked at from that perspective, then like the hero archetype, even in like Spider-Man or like Superman or all these other things, can be like a symbol of the essential self, right? And like the journey of the self towards like actualizing its potential in the world. Right. But there's a flip side to it where it's like you have like that esoteric interpretation of it, but then you have more of like a public exoteric interpretation of like Jesus as the individual that's going to save humanity and come back. So like Yogananda was basically saying like the second coming of the Christ is actually the self-realization of the world. But then there's also this belief of like Jesus, the person, is going to come on a cloud in the sky and he's going to make everything better, you know. And so it's like one is a very empowering kind of like narrative, the other is a very disempowering
Comes
narrative.
from within.
Right. So it's like the same thing with the hero, where it's like, you know, this individual is going to come and like save the world, and that's how everything is going to change. This very messianic view of like whether it's like political leaders or this messianic view of like other types of leaders that are going to come and fix everything versus this view that like change on a global scale is going to be brought about as like a collective project that's the result of like all of us working together to like do our part to like make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And big distinction, I think, between this view of like great men make history versus like history is made by like masses of people. Or like the heroic mass versus the heroic individual. The heroic mass is like the group of people that find a hero inside of them versus like the individual hero that saves, you know, the disempowered, like whatever.
Edward Snowden has one of the, this ties directly into what you just said. Edward Snowden has one of the best quotes I've ever heard, and it's, "There are no heroes, only heroic decisions." Yeah, and I think that's, I think that's a good foot end.
Yeah,
I'm so glad I had you on this show.
I am too.
This has been fantastic, and if you're listening to us and you've enjoyed this, if you want to jump in on the conversation, this is not a two-way thing between me and Julian. If you want to get and leave a comment or send an email or send a message if you or whatever, we'd be more than happy to talk about anything you whatever. The foot end of this one is we were talking about superheroes and environmental impressions on men and how we get to be how we are and what we can do to solve that. And talked about being black and being black men and being in meditation circles and trying to tackle on these issues. The next episode, I would like to talk about more of the more of what we just kind of were rounding out at the end there. You know, spending maybe another hour talking about that. What do you think?
Yeah, I would love to have that conversation. I'm actually also really excited to hear this recording because I thought that the conversation went down a lot of really amazing routes. And totally.
Definitely. Okay, so let's pray that I recorded it successfully. It does. Okay, it still says, yeah, it says still recording. I'm going to hit. Okay. Let's say bye before I hit stop recording. Bye, everybody, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Yeah.